Sophia Brooks had cleaned the Ricci mansion for exactly 3 hours before her entire world fell apart. The windows were spotless, the bookshelves dusted. The marble floor gleamed beneath her feet. All that remained, was the mafia boss's private study, the one room every servant had been warned never to linger in. Sophia quietly stepped inside, feather duster in hand. She wiped the shelves, straightened a stack of leather-bound books, then reached up to dust the enormous family portrait hanging above the fireplace. She looked at it, once, twice. Then her heart stopped. The feather duster slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a soft thud. No, her lips trembled. No, that's impossible. The little boy smiling beside mafia boss Costantino Ricci had her son's eyes, her son's smile, her son's tiny scar above his left eyebrow. Even the small dimple that appeared only when he laughed. Sophia stumbled backward so fast she knocked over an antique chair. The noise echoed through the study. Footsteps approached. The study door opened. Costantino Ricci walked in. Tall, calm, feared by every criminal in New York. His deep voice broke the silence. "Is something wrong?" Sophia couldn't breathe. Her shaking finger slowly lifted toward the portrait. Tears filled her eyes. Then she asked the question that would shatter two families forever. "Sir, why is my son in your family portrait?" Costantino frowned, confused. Then he looked up at the painting. His expression changed instantly, because the child Sophia was pointing at was the little boy he had spent the last 7 years raising as his own. Neither of them knew it yet. But one question was about to uncover the greatest mistake anyone had ever made. Before we go one page further, I need you to sit with that question for a second, because I still am. A maid, a mafia boss, a portrait that shouldn't exist, and a little boy who looks like he was pulled straight out of her memories. If you were Sophia, standing in that study, with your whole body shaking, would you have said anything at all? Or would you have backed out of that room and pretended you never saw it? Tell me in the comments. And I want your theories, because I know this story is about to break some hearts. Do you think Costantino stole that child? Do you think someone lied to both of them? Or do you think the truth is something neither of them is prepared to survive? Drop your guess below, because I promise you, the real answer is more heartbreaking than anything you're imagining right now. If you felt your stomach drop the way Sophia's did, hit that like button. Subscribe, because this family is about to be tested by love, loss, and a lie, 7 years in the making. Let's begin. The Ricci estate looked less like a home and more like a warning. Wrought iron gates, cameras angled at every hedge, a driveway so long Sophia Brooks had time to talk herself out of the job twice before she reached the front door. "You're doing this for Ethan," she muttered, tightening her ponytail like it was armor. Not for the paycheck, for Ethan. Though if she was honest, it was absolutely for the paycheck too. 7-year-olds needed shoes that fit, and dentist visits, and, apparently, $40 a week for something called Robotics Club, that Sophia was fairly certain just meant expensive Legos. Maria Alvarez met her at the staff entrance, keys jangling from her belt like a warden. "You're the new girl. Sophia Brooks." Maria, head of housekeeping, keeper of secrets, occasional therapist. Maria looked her up and down, not unkindly. "First rule of this house, you clean everything except the study." "What's in the study?" "Mr. Ricci." Maria said it the way other people said. "Loaded gun. He works from home most mornings. You go in, you clean quiet, you leave quiet. You don't touch his desk, you don't ask questions, you don't linger. Got it. Ninja mode." Maria almost smiled. Almost. Sophia had heard the name Costantino Ricci the way most people in the city had, in hushed tones, usually followed by someone changing the subject. Import-export mogul, real estate empire, and, if you believe the rumors nobody said out loud in polite company, the reason certain problems in this city simply stopped being problems. She told herself none of that mattered. A house was a house. Dust didn't care who owned the furniture. The mansion swallowed her whole for the first 3 hours. Marble floors that reflected the chandeliers, bookshelves that smelled like money and old paper, windows so tall Sophia needed the extendable duster just to reach the top panes. She worked fast, the way she'd trained herself to work fast at every job since Ethan was born, because time was the one thing she never had enough of. By 11, only one room remained. The study door stood slightly ajar, sunlight slicing gold across dark hardwood. Sophia hesitated on the threshold, Maria's warning replaying in her head. You don't linger. She wasn't going to linger. She was going to dust, straighten, and leave, in exactly that order, like a woman with excellent decision-making skills. The room smelled like cedar and leather and something colder underneath. Power, maybe, if power had a scent. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a desk the size of a small boat. And above the fireplace, impossible to avoid, a portrait large enough to watch her from every angle of the room. Costantino Ricci stood in the painting exactly the way she imagined he stood in life. Tall, unsmiling, one hand resting protectively on the shoulder of a little boy beside him. Sophia's feather duster moved across the mantel on autopilot, while her eyes drifted upward, half curious, half bored, the way you'd glance at any stranger's family photo. Then she actually looked. The duster slipped from her fingers. It hit the floor with a soft, useless thud that seemed impossibly loud in the silent room. The boy in the portrait had dark curls that fell across his forehead in the exact same cowlick pattern Sophia fought with a comb every single morning. A small, pale scar interrupted the arch of his left eyebrow, the same shape, the same size, as the one Ethan had earned falling off a swing set at 4 years old. And there, faint but unmistakable in the artist's careful brushwork, a single dimple denting one cheek, Ethan's dimple. The one that only appeared when he laughed at his own jokes. "No," Sophia whispered, stepping back so fast she caught the edge of an antique chair with her hip. It toppled, cracking hard against the floor. "No, that's impossible." Footsteps. Fast. Controlled. Closing the distance down the hallway. The door swung open fully. Costantino Ricci filled the doorway, the way the rumors had promised he would. Tall, composed, dressed in black, like the portrait had come to life to check on her. Gray-blue eyes swept the room, the fallen chair, the duster on the floor, and finally landed on her face. "Is something wrong?" His voice was low, measured, not unkind, but not warm either, the voice of a man who rarely needed to raise it to be obeyed. Sophia couldn't answer. Her chest had locked up somewhere between disbelief and a grief she thought she'd buried 7 years ago. "Miss," he paused, clearly searching for a name Maria hadn't yet given him. "Brooks," Sophia managed. "Sophia Brooks." Her hand lifted before her brain gave permission, one shaking finger pointing up at the portrait, at the boy with her son's eyes, her son's smile, her son's small private scar that only a mother who'd cleaned that cut and kissed it and cried over it in a hospital 7 years ago could possibly recognize. "Sir," her voice cracked clean in half, "why is my son in your family portrait?" Silence dropped over the study like a held breath. Costantino's frown deepened, confusion flickering across features that Sophia suspected rarely allowed anything to flicker at all. He followed the line of her trembling hand up to the painting, to his son standing beside him in oil and gold frame, painted the year Luca turned 5. Whatever he saw when he looked at it changed his face entirely. The calm control cracked, just slightly, just enough for Sophia to see something underneath it. Not anger. Something closer to alarm. "That," Costantino said slowly, each word deliberate, careful, like a man testing ground he wasn't sure would hold his weight, "is my son, Luca. He's 7 years old." I've raised him since he was born." "That's impossible," Sophia said, though her voice had lost all its conviction. "That's my son's face. I would know my own child's face anywhere." "Mrs. Brooks." "Ms." The correction came out reflexive, absurd given the moment, and she almost laughed at herself for it. Costantino studied her for a long, unreadable moment, gray-blue eyes moving between her face and the portrait like he was searching for a resemblance he desperately wanted to dismiss and couldn't quite manage. "You're mistaken," he said finally, though something in his tone suggested he didn't fully believe his own words. "It happens. Children look alike at that age. Not like this." Sophia's hands had started shaking harder, the grief she'd carried since she was 22 years old, rising up her throat like floodwater breaking a dam. Not the scar, not the dimple, not that exact cowlick that makes his hair stick up on the left side no matter how much product you use. Costantino said nothing, but Sophia saw it, the flicker of doubt crossing his composed features, quick and involuntary, gone almost as fast as it appeared. "I think you should go home for the day," he said quietly. "I'll have Maria arrange your pay." "You're firing me?" "I'm giving you time to compose yourself." His voice remained steady, controlled, betraying nothing of the unease Sophia was almost certain she'd glimpsed a moment ago. "This has clearly been distressing for you." Sophia left the mansion with her hands still trembling, Maria's confused stare following her down the marble hallway. The memory of that portrait burned behind her eyes, like she'd stared too long at the sun. She didn't see Costantino standing at his study window, watching her small car disappear down the long driveway, phone already pressed to his ear. "Marco," he said, voice low enough that no servant in the house could overhear. "I need everything you can find on a woman named Sophia Brooks. Background, family, medical history if you can get it." A pause, his eyes drifting back to the portrait above the fireplace, to the boy with the same cowlick, the same scar, the same dimple he'd watched appear 1,000 times at his own dinner table. "Tonight," Costantino said. "I need it tonight." Marco Bellini delivered the file at 7 the next morning, sliding a manila folder across the desk, with the particular reluctance of a man who suspected his boss wouldn't like what was inside. "Sophia Brooks," Marco said. 29, widowed at 23 when her husband died in a construction accident. One son, Ethan, age 7. She's worked 3 jobs simultaneously for most of the last 5 years. No criminal record, no red flags, no reason at all to be standing in your study accusing you of raising her child. Costantino didn't look up from the folder. "Medical history?" "Gave birth at a hospital in Queens, St. Gabriel Medical Center." Marco hesitated. "The same hospital where Isabella delivered Luca." Costantino's hand went very still on the page. St. Gabriel had closed its maternity ward permanently after the attack. The fire had destroyed most of the records before anyone thought to protect them. He'd spent the first year after Isabella's death trying to piece together exactly what happened that night, and he'd stopped only because every answer led to the same unbearable place. His wife, gone. His son, an orphan handed to him hours after the smoke cleared, though even that detail had always sat strangely in his memory, half-formed, wrapped in grief too thick to examine closely. "Coincidence," he said, mostly to himself. Marco didn't look convinced. Neither, if Costantino was honest, did he. "She's coming back today," Costantino said. "I want her watched, quietly. I want to know everything she does, everyone she talks to, and whether anyone put her up to yesterday's performance. And if no one did?" Costantino closed the folder. "Then I want to understand why a woman with nothing to gain would walk into my study and accuse me of something that could get her killed." Sophia almost didn't show up. She'd spent half the night convincing herself she'd imagined the whole thing, grief playing tricks, exhaustion painting Ethan's face onto a stranger's portrait. The other half of the night, she'd spent staring at Ethan's baby photos spread across her kitchen table, comparing scars and cowlicks until Rosa finally took the phone from her hands and told her to sleep. "You'll lose the job if you don't go back," her mother said, not unkindly, tucking a blanket around Ethan's shoulders in the next room. And baby, we need the job. So Sophia went back, spine straight, chin up, ready to apologize for the outburst and pretend the entire episode had been a symptom of low blood sugar. She didn't get the chance. A small boy sat cross-legged in the mansion's east hallway, surrounded by a scattered galaxy of paper stars taped haphazardly to a poster board, a pair of scissors clutched in one hand. "You're new," the boy said, without looking up. "Papa said someone new was starting." "I am." "Sophia." She crouched beside him, unable to help herself. "What are you working on?" "Solar system project. Miss Whitfield says I have to present it Thursday." He held up a lumpy paper sphere that was supposed to be Saturn, but looked more like a confused meatball. "The rings keep falling off." "May I?" Sophia took the sphere gently, turning it over. "You need to glue the rings before you attach them to the string, not after. Otherwise gravity wins every time." The boy looked up at her properly for the first time. Sophia's breath caught somewhere in her throat. Dark curls. A cowlick on the left side that refused to lie flat. Gray-blue eyes that belonged to his father, but the shape of his face, the particular tilt of his chin, when he studied something new. It was like looking at Ethan through water, familiar and warped all at once. "I'm Luca," the boy said, apparently unbothered by her sudden silence. "It's nice to meet you, Luca." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Are you going to cry?" Luca asked, with the blunt honesty only 7-year-olds possessed. "Your eyes look wet." "Allergies," Sophia said. "Terrible time of year for it." "It's November." "Exactly. Worst month for allergies. Everybody knows that." Luca considered this with the gravity of a tiny judge weighing evidence, then apparently decided to let it go, handing her the glue stick instead. "Can you fix Saturn?" They fixed Saturn together on the hallway floor, and Jupiter after that, Sophia guiding small hands through careful lines of glue, while something aching and confused settled behind her ribs. She told herself it was nothing. Children reminded mothers of their own children all the time. That was simply how grief worked. It found reflections everywhere, whether they were real or not. "You're good at this," said a voice above them. Costantino stood at the end of the hallway, sleeves rolled to his forearms, watching the scene with an expression Sophia hadn't seen on him yesterday, something softer, unguarded, entirely at odds with the mafia boss the whole city apparently feared. "I have practice," Sophia said. 7-year-old at home. Similar chaos, similar glue-related emergencies. "Papa, look, Saturn has rings again." Luca held up his handiwork triumphantly. "Excellent work." Costantino crouched, actually crouched, knees on marble, a man who owned half the city's shipping lanes, lowering himself to eye level with a paper planet. "Tell Ms. Brooks thank you." "Thank you, Ms. Brooks. Just Sophia is fine." "Miss Sophia, then," Luca decided, apparently unwilling to fully abandon formality, and scampered off toward the kitchen in search of, by his own announcement, a snack that isn't vegetables. Costantino remained crouched a moment longer than necessary, watching his son disappear around the corner, and Sophia caught something in his face before he stood. A tenderness he clearly reserved for very few people. A father whose entire hardened reputation apparently evaporated in his own son's presence. "You're good with him," Costantino said, rising. "I'm good with kids in general. It's grown men I have trouble with." She caught herself immediately. "Sir, don't do that." "Do what?" "Add." "Sir." To soften something you didn't actually mean to soften. Sophia blinked, caught, a laugh escaping before she could stop it. "Fine. I have trouble with grown men. No sir attached." "Better." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. A rare visitor to a face built for composure. "I owe you an apology for yesterday. I dismissed your concerns without properly considering them. You dismissed a woman who accused you of stealing her son while standing under a portrait of your own family. I think that's a fairly reasonable reaction." Perhaps. He studied her. Gray-blue eyes unreadable, in a different way than yesterday. Less alarm now. More careful curiosity. Marco tells me you've raised your son alone since your husband passed. Marco tells you a lot. Apparently. She crossed her arms. Did you have me investigated overnight, Mr. Ricci? Yes. The blunt honesty caught her off guard. Most men at least pretend to feel guilty about that. I don't see the point in pretending. He held her gaze steadily. You made an extraordinary accusation in my private study on your first day of employment. I'd be a poor businessman if I didn't verify who I was dealing with. And? Did I pass inspection? You raised a child alone while working 3 jobs and never once asked anyone for help you weren't owed. Something in his voice shifted, quieter now. That's not nothing. Sophia didn't have a joke ready for that one. The compliment sat strangely against her ribs, warm in a way she hadn't expected from a man the whole city seemed to fear. For what it's worth, she said finally, I don't actually think you stole my son, Mr. Ricci. I think I'm a grieving mother who saw something in a painting that scared her more than it should have. Perhaps, Costantino said again, though this time the word carried none of yesterday's certainty. They found their way to the kitchen eventually, drawn by Luca's escalating negotiations with Maria over the definition of snack, and Sophia stood in the doorway, watching father and son argue cheerfully about whether cookies counted as a food group, something loosening in her chest that had been wound tight since the moment she'd seen that portrait. Luca laughed at something his father said, a full, unguarded laugh, and the dimple appeared on his left cheek exactly the way Ethan's did, exactly in the same place, at exactly the same angle. Sophia's amusement died in her throat. She hadn't realized she was staring until Costantino's voice cut gently through the quiet. Sophia. She looked up. Her eyes had filled without permission, tears blurring the kitchen's warm light into something soft and unbearable. Costantino's gaze moved between her face and his son's, something working behind his composed expression. Confusion, curiosity, the same unease she'd glimpsed yesterday in the study, back again and settling in for good. Have we met before? He asked quietly. Before yesterday, I mean. Somewhere. Some other time. Sophia opened her mouth to answer. She had absolutely no idea what the truth was anymore. Sophia never answered the question in the kitchen. She'd mumbled something about déjà vu, about tired eyes and long shifts, and Costantino had let it go with the particular grace of a man who noticed everything but chose, for now, not to push. 3 weeks later, the question still followed her through the mansion's hallways, like a shadow she couldn't outrun. Have we met before? No, they hadn't. And yet something about this house had started to feel less like a job and more like a place she recognized in her bones. You've been humming, Maria said one morning, catching Sophia dusting the east wing with an actual smile on her face. Nobody hums in this house. Not since, she stopped herself. Since what? Since Mrs. Ricci passed. Maria's voice softened. This place used to have music in it. Isabella used to play piano in the sitting room every evening. After she died, Mr. Ricci had the piano moved to storage. Said the silence was easier. Sophia looked down the long hallway, past the closed sitting room door, and felt something tighten in her chest for a woman she'd never met. He doesn't seem like a man who takes the easy road on much of anything, Sophia said. No, Maria agreed. But grief makes exceptions of all of us. The mansion had begun changing in small, unannounced ways since Sophia arrived, though she doubted anyone but Maria had noticed. Luca left his bedroom door open now instead of closed. He'd started requesting she read to him after dinner, insisting on the same battered astronomy book 3 nights running until he'd memorized whole pages. The kitchen staff had learned to expect her opinions on everything from seasoning to scheduling, delivered with enough humor that even Maria's sternest lieutenants had started laughing along instead of bristling. And Costantino had started finding reasons to be in whatever room she occupied. "You're doing the ledgers in the kitchen," he observed one evening, finding her at the counter with Ricci Holdings' quarterly reports spread beside a batch of cooling cookies, a task Maria had roped her into when the usual bookkeeper called in sick. "The study makes me itchy. Too many memories of accidentally accusing my employer of kidnapping." She didn't look up from the numbers. "Also, the kitchen smells better. You bake while doing accounting. Multitasking. It's a skill." She held out a cookie without looking at him. "Try one. Tell me if they're better than whatever your imported French pastry chef makes." Costantino took the cookie, ate it, said nothing for a long moment. "They're better," he admitted finally, like the confession cost him something. "I knew it." Sophia grinned, victorious. "Don't tell Pierre. He'll cry into his croissants." "Pierre doesn't cry. Pierre threatens to quit approximately once a month and has never once followed through. Sounds like Pierre and I have a lot in common." She finally looked up, catching him still standing there, tie loosened, looking less like the feared businessman the tabloids described, and more like a tired man who'd found an unexpected reason to linger in his own kitchen. "You don't have to stand guard, you know. I'm not going to steal the good silverware. I'm not standing guard." He pulled out the stool across from her and sat, an action so uncharacteristically casual that Sophia nearly dropped her pen. "I'm taking a break." "From what?" "Everything." He rubbed his temple, and for a moment, the careful control slipped, showing her the exhaustion underneath. "There's a shipment dispute in Newark, a councilman who wants favors he hasn't earned, and a rival family that's been unusually quiet lately, which is somehow worse than when they're loud." "Sounds exhausting. Have you tried complaining about it to a stranger while eating cookies?" "Very therapeutic. I recommend it." "Is that a professional opinion?" "Extensive personal experience. I complained to my mailman for 2 years before I realized he'd started avoiding my street." She pushed the plate closer. "Eat another cookie. Tell me about Luca instead. He mentioned wanting a telescope for Christmas approximately 40 times today." And just like that, something in Costantino's shoulders eased, and he talked, actually talked, about Luca's obsession with Saturn's rings, about the way his son asked questions Costantino didn't always know how to answer, about a life that had felt, for 7 years, like a single narrow hallway with no doors. "It's different lately," he admitted quietly. "This house, it feels different." "Different how?" He looked at her for a long moment, gray-blue eyes searching her face for something she couldn't name. "Occupied," he said finally. "It used to just feel large." Sophia's chest ached with something warm and terrifying, and she reached for her pen again, needing somewhere else to put her hands. "Well, don't get used to it. Once I finish these ledgers, I'm going back to dusting, and dusting doesn't come with cookies. I'll make Maria assign you the kitchen permanently." "You can't just reassign staff because you like their baking." "I own the house, Sophia. I can do almost anything I want in it." The way he said her name, unhurried, deliberate, sent a small unwanted shiver down her spine that she chose to blame entirely on the kitchen's air conditioning. She didn't know, as she gathered the ledgers an hour later and said goodnight, that a car had been parked 3 blocks from the estate's rear gate for the better part of 2 weeks, its occupant photographing every staff member who came and went, cross-referencing faces against a list compiled by a man named Vittorio Gallo, who had recently developed a very specific interest in anyone connected to St. Gabriel Medical Center 7 years ago. The photograph of Sophia leaving the estate that evening was flagged within the hour. Sophia found the bracelet 3 days later. Luca had asked her to help him find an old drawing for a school project, something he'd made when he was 4, tucked away somewhere in his room's overflowing memory boxes. And Sophia had knelt on his bedroom floor sorting through years of finger paintings and macaroni art with the particular tenderness of a woman who kept every scrap of Ethan's childhood in a similar box at home. Near the bottom of the second box, beneath a stack of preschool report cards, her fingers closed around something small, plastic, and cold. A hospital identification bracelet, faded nearly to illegibility, the kind wrapped around a newborn's tiny wrist in the first hours of life. Sophia turned it over slowly, heart already climbing into her throat, before her eyes found the printed text. St. Gabriel Medical Center. Her own hospital, her own maternity ward. The same 3 words, stamped on a bracelet she still kept, folded carefully in tissue paper, in a drawer at home, beside a single baby photograph and a birth certificate for a son who supposedly never took a breath. Her hands had started shaking again, the same way they'd shaken in the study 3 weeks ago, because printed beneath the hospital's name, smudged but still readable if she tilted it toward the lamplight, was a date. The exact date Ethan was born. Sophia didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table long after Ethan and her mother had gone to bed, the faded hospital bracelet resting on a paper towel in front of her, like evidence at a crime scene she didn't yet understand. Beside it, she'd laid out her own, the one she'd kept for 7 years, tissue-wrapped in the back of her dresser drawer, printed with a date she'd memorized so completely she could recite it in her sleep. The dates matched. She told herself that meant nothing. St. Gabriel delivered dozens of babies a week, hundreds of bracelets, printed with hundreds of dates, handed to hundreds of mothers who'd never met each other and never would. But Luca's cowlick, Luca's scar, Luca's dimple. She pressed her palms flat against the table until the shaking stopped and told herself, for the 100th time, that grief made people see ghosts in strangers' faces. She went back to work the next morning anyway, because rent didn't care about ghosts. Costantino hadn't slept either. He sat in his study long past midnight, old hospital records spread across his desk, files he'd paid considerably to have quietly retrieved, considering St. Gabriel's maternity ward records had supposedly burned along with half the building 7 years ago. What remained were fragments, partial admission logs, a handful of names that had survived the fire in a records room 2 floors away from where it started. Sophia Brooks's name wasn't among them. That should have settled something. Instead, it unsettled him further, because a woman with no fire-damaged record should have had a complete one somewhere, and the complete absence of her name felt less like an accident and more like a hole cut deliberately out of a larger picture. He rubbed his eyes, exhaustion pulling at the edges of 8 years of careful control, and reached for his phone. "Marco, I need Dr. Moretti at the estate tomorrow. Tell him it's about Luca's annual physical." A pause. "And find out if St. Gabriel's original admission logs still exist anywhere. Storage, backup servers, anything." He didn't examine too closely why his pulse hadn't slowed since the moment Sophia said, "My son." In front of that portrait, Dr. Lorenzo Moretti arrived at the Ricci estate at 11 the next morning, black bag in hand. The same unhurried calm he'd worn for 30 years of house calls settled over his weathered face. He was halfway across the foyer when he saw her. Sophia stood near the staircase, laughing at something Luca had said, sunlight catching the curl of her dark hair, and Lorenzo's whole body went rigid, the black bag nearly slipping from his fingers. He knew that face, not from a photograph, not from a passing memory. He knew it from a hospital corridor 7 years ago, from a young woman's hand gripping his sleeve as she begged him to check on her babies before the smoke got worse, from the moment, hours later, when a nurse had told him with tears in her eyes that the woman from bed 14 hadn't survived the evacuation. "Doctor?" Maria's voice, concerned, cut through the ringing in his ears. "You've gone pale. Are you unwell?" "I'm fine." His voice came out thinner than he intended. "Long drive. I'll be fine." He kept his eyes fixed forward as he crossed the foyer toward Costantino's study, refusing to look at Sophia again, though her laugh followed him down the hallway like something reaching for his collar. "It's not possible," he told himself, hands trembling as he set his bag down inside the study door. "She died. I signed the paperwork myself." But he hadn't. He remembered that now, 7 years too late, he'd never actually seen the body. He'd simply been told, by an overwhelmed night nurse in a hospital collapsing into chaos, that the woman from bed 14 was gone, and he'd been holding an orphaned infant at the time, and there had been no time at all, to verify anything before he made the decision that changed 4 lives forever. His hands didn't stop shaking for the rest of Luca's physical. Sofia found Costantino in the kitchen again that night, exactly where she'd started expecting to find him. Tie loosened, sleeves rolled, a glass of wine he wasn't really drinking sitting untouched beside a stack of paperwork he wasn't really reading. "You look like a man who found something he didn't want to find," she said, sliding onto the stool across from him. "I looked into the hospital records. From the night my wife died. He didn't dress it up, didn't soften it the way most men might have, with a woman he was still, cautiously, learning to trust. Your name isn't in them. Nothing about you at all." Sofia's stomach dropped, though she kept her face carefully neutral. "Records get lost in fires, Costantino. Some records do." His gray-blue eyes held hers, steady, searching. "But entire people don't usually disappear that cleanly." "What are you saying?" "I don't know yet," he exhaled, rubbing a hand across his jaw. And for a moment, the careful control slipped entirely, showing her a man who'd spent 7 years grieving without ever fully understanding what he was grieving. "I keep circling back to the same impossible question, and I can't make it fit anywhere sensible. Maybe some questions don't have sensible answers. That's not comforting. I wasn't trying to comfort you. I was trying to be honest." She reached across the counter without fully deciding to, her hand covering his where it rested against the cool marble. "For what it's worth, I don't think either of us is imagining this. I just don't know what this is yet." His hand turned beneath hers, fingers lacing through her own, and the kitchen went very quiet, the only sound the low hum of the refrigerator and both their uneven breathing. Sofia. Her name in his voice had changed over these 3 weeks, softened into something that made her pulse climb every time he used it. "I need to say something, and I don't entirely trust myself to say it well. Try anyway." He leaned in, slow enough that she could have pulled away, close enough that she felt his breath against her cheek, warm and certain. The kitchen door swung open. "Mr. Ricci." Marco stood in the doorway, expression tight, phone still in hand. "Dr. Moretti called the house line twice in the last 10 minutes. He says it's urgent. He wouldn't say why." Costantino straightened, the moment shattering as fast as it had built, and Sofia pulled her hand back into her own lap, cheeks warm, heart hammering with something that felt dangerously close to disappointment. "Put him through to my study," Costantino said, voice already shifting back into its controlled register, though his eyes lingered on Sofia a beat longer than necessary before he left the room. Across the city, in the small, book-lined study of his own quiet home, Dr. Lorenzo Moretti sat with his phone pressed to his ear, listening to it ring, his other hand shaking so badly he nearly dropped the framed photograph he'd pulled from a locked drawer. A photograph of a young woman in a hospital bed, holding 2 newborn boys, taken hours before everything burned. The line connected. He opened his mouth to speak. Then, staring at the photograph, at a face he'd convinced himself for 7 years belonged to a dead woman, he whispered the words that had haunted him since the moment he'd seen her laughing in that foyer. She was supposed to be dead. Whatever Dr. Lorenzo had called about that night, Costantino never mentioned it. He'd returned to the kitchen an hour later, jaw tight, something guarded settling back over his features, and told Sofia only that it was a scheduling matter, before changing the subject so firmly she hadn't pushed. She recognized deflection when she saw it. She'd used it plenty herself, and let it go, though the unfinished moment between them, the almost kiss neither of them acknowledged, lingered in the kitchen air for days afterward like a held breath. Life at the estate kept moving anyway, the way life always did, indifferent to unanswered questions. Sophia found herself woven into the household's rhythms so gradually she barely noticed it happening. She knew which cabinet held Luca's favorite cereal, knew that Costantino took his coffee black except on the mornings after bad news, when he wanted it sweet enough to mask something. She'd started correcting the kitchen staff's grocery orders without being asked, started signing permission slips for Luca's field trips when Costantino was buried in calls, started existing in the house not as a maid, but as something the staff had quietly begun calling, when they thought she couldn't hear, the lady of the house. She told herself, every single time, that it meant nothing, that she was simply good at her job. She stopped believing that the night Luca woke up screaming. She heard it from 2 floors down, a thin, terrified cry cutting through the mansion's usual silence, and was up the stairs before she'd fully processed moving, following the sound to Luca's room, where she found him sitting bolt upright in bed, small body shaking, tears streaming down a face still caught somewhere between sleep and terror. Hey, sweetheart, I'm here." She crossed the room without hesitation, gathering him against her chest, the exact way she'd held Ethan through 100 nightmares of his own. "You're safe. It was just a dream." "There was fire," Luca sobbed against her shoulder. "Everywhere. And I couldn't find—" He stopped, confused by his own words, the way children often were by dreams that felt more like memory than imagination. "I don't know. I couldn't find someone. It's over now. You're okay." She rocked him gently, humming something low and wordless, and felt the moment his small body finally began to unwind against her. She didn't hear Costantino in the doorway until she looked up. He stood there in a rumpled undershirt, hair disheveled from sleep, watching the two of them with an expression so unguarded it stole the breath from her lungs. Not gratitude exactly, though there was plenty of that. Something deeper. Something that looked, unmistakably, like a man watching a piece of his life click into place that he hadn't realized was missing. "I've got him," Sophia said softly. "Go back to bed." "I don't want to." Costantino crossed the room instead, sitting on the edge of the mattress, one large hand smoothing gently over his son's hair. "Luca gets these sometimes. Since Isabella, I never know quite what to say. You don't have to say anything perfect. You just have to stay." She met his eyes over Luca's dark curls, and something passed between them, unspoken and enormous, neither of them brave enough yet to name it. They sat together until Luca's breathing evened into real sleep, the three of them arranged around each other in a shape that felt, terrifyingly, like a family Sophia had no right to want. Because that was the truth she couldn't outrun anymore, sitting on the edge of a mafia boss's son's bed at 2 in the morning. She was falling for Costantino Ricci, not for his money, not for the marble floors or the careful power that hummed beneath everything he did, but for the man who crouched to fix paper planets, who canceled meetings for school recitals, who sat in the dark holding his son and admitting he didn't always know the right words. A man like that didn't end up with a widowed maid. Not really. Not permanently. She told herself that walking back to her own small room that night, and didn't quite manage to believe it. Vittorio Gallo received the report 3 days later, delivered by a nervous underling who clearly understood the danger of bringing him bad news. "Someone's been pulling old hospital records," the man said. "St. Gabriel, the maternity ward. Whoever's asking has resources. Private investigators, maybe more." Vittorio set down his glass slowly. 7 years of careful silence, and now someone was digging through ashes he'd worked very hard to make sure stayed buried. "Find out who," he said, "and find out what they know." By the time Sophia left the estate that evening, walking the familiar path toward the staff parking area past the rear gate, she had no idea that a man in a dark sedan had been parked there for 2 hours, watching, waiting for exactly this. The maid, alone, no security in easy reach, the last remaining thread connecting a 7-year-old cover-up to the truth Vittorio Gallo could not afford to let surface. She'd barely reached her car when a hand closed hard around her arm from behind, yanking her back into the shadows between two parked vehicles, a second hand clamping firm over her mouth before she could scream. Sophia's scream died against a gloved palm, her heart slamming so hard she felt it in her teeth. The man dragging her backward was strong, efficient, clearly practiced at exactly this, and some distant, terrified corner of her mind registered that this wasn't a mugging. Muggings didn't come with a second man already opening a car door 20 feet away, engine running, waiting. She bit down, hard, into the fleshy heel of his palm, and the man's grip loosened just enough for her to twist free and scream. One raw, full-throated sound that tore through the quiet parking area before his hand found her again. The security floodlights snapped on. "Get away from her!" Costantino's voice cut across the lot like a blade, low and absolutely lethal. And Sophia had never in her life heard a sound so terrifying and so reassuring in the same breath. He was already moving, faster than a man his size should have been able to move. 3 of his men fanning out behind him with a speed that spoke of drills run 100 times for exactly this situation. The man holding her hesitated a fraction of a second too long. Costantino closed the distance and drove his fist into the man's jaw, with a force that dropped him instantly, Sophia stumbling free as the second man abandoned the open car door and sprinted for the shadows, 2 of Costantino's men peeling off in immediate pursuit. "Sophia!" Costantino's hands found her shoulders, her face, checking her with a thoroughness that had nothing to do with employer concern and everything to do with something rawer. "Look at me. Are you hurt?" "I'm okay." Her voice shook badly. "I'm okay. I think. I don't." She didn't finish the sentence. She simply folded forward into his chest, and his arms came around her instantly. Absolutely. Like he'd been waiting his whole life for an excuse to hold on that tightly. "I've got you." His voice had dropped, rough now, stripped of its usual careful control. "I've got you. You're safe." They stood like that longer than either of them could account for afterward, security swarming the lot around them, the man Costantino had struck now zip-tied and unconscious on the pavement, and none of it registering to Sophia as anything beyond the solid, steady beat of Costantino's heart beneath her cheek. "Why would anyone want to hurt me?" she whispered finally, pulling back enough to look at him. "I'm nobody, Costantino. I clean houses. I don't have money. I don't have enemies. I don't know." His jaw was tight, gray-blue eyes dark with something that looked like fury, barely leashed. "But I intend to find out, and whoever's responsible is going to regret it considerably." "That's not comforting. I told you before, I wasn't trying to comfort you." His hand came up, brushing a trembling strand of hair from her face with a gentleness that contradicted every word of threat he'd just spoken. "I was trying to be honest. You matter to me, Sophia, more than I fully understood, until I heard you scream." Her breath caught. "Costantino." "I'm not finished." His thumb traced along her cheekbone, and the careful distance he'd maintained for 3 weeks seemed to dissolve entirely in the floodlit dark. "I don't know what this is, exactly. I don't have a tidy name for it. But I know I would have torn this entire city apart tonight if that man had gotten you into that car." "I'm scared," she admitted, quieter now. "Not just of whoever grabbed me. Of this. Of you. Of how much I've started needing to see your face every day. Then be scared with me instead of alone." He pressed his forehead gently to hers, the gesture more intimate than any kiss could have been. "I'm not going anywhere, Sophia. Not now." Neither of them said the word. Love? It hovered there anyway, unspoken and enormous, in the space between their breath. Costantino doubled her security within the hour. A car assigned to follow her home. A man stationed discreetly near her mother's apartment. Measures Sophia argued against exactly once before the memory of gloved hands over her mouth silenced her objections completely. She returned to the estate the next morning, still shaken, determined to bury herself in ordinary work until her hands stopped trembling, and went looking for her own personnel file in the estate's administrative office. A small, foolish errand, checking whether her emergency contact information was current, in case something like last night happened again. The filing cabinet drawer under B held nothing with her name on it. She checked twice, then a third time, pulling files on either side to be sure she hadn't simply missed it, her stomach tightening with a dread she couldn't yet name. Her file was gone, not misplaced. Gone. No trace, no gap left behind, as though someone had removed it and smoothed the space over so thoroughly no one would think to notice. Across the city, in the quiet of his study, Dr. Lorenzo Moretti sat with a blank sheet of paper in front of him, a pen trembling in his hand, the photograph of a young mother and 2 newborn boys propped against his desk lamp. He'd started the letter 4 times already, torn up 4 attempts at words that felt too small for the truth they were meant to carry. He tried once more, forcing his hand steady. To Costantino and Sofia, he wrote, "There is something I have carried for 7 years that I no longer have the right to keep from either of you." He set the pen down and wept. Sofia found Dr. Lorenzo's address through Maria, who gave it up reluctantly, and only after Sofia promised, falsely, that she only wanted to thank him for Luca's checkup. She stood on his front porch 2 days after her file vanished from the estate archives, the missing folder sitting like a stone in her chest, certain in some instinctive, unprovable way that the kind, unsettled doctor from the foyer held answers she desperately needed. He opened the door and went pale the instant he saw her. "Miss Brooks," his voice came out strained, his hand tightening on the doorframe like he needed it to stay upright. I wasn't expecting. I need to ask you something, doctor, and I need you to be honest with me." Sofia kept her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "You looked at me in that foyer like you'd seen a ghost. I want to know why." "I don't know what you mean." "You do." She stepped closer, desperation cracking through her careful composure. "I gave birth at St. Gabriel's 7 years ago. The same hospital, the same year Isabella Ricci died. I found a hospital bracelet in Luca's things with my son's exact birth date on it. And you look at me like you're afraid I'm about to accuse you of something you actually did." Lorenzo's face had gone the color of old paper. "You should go home, Ms. Brooks. Please." Her voice broke. "I'm not trying to hurt anyone. I just need to understand why my son's face is hanging in a mafia boss's family portrait." For one unbearable moment, something in the old doctor's eyes wavered. Decades of careful medical composure fracturing under the weight of a question he'd spent 7 years dreading. Sofia held her breath, certain he was about to speak. Instead, he stepped back, closing the door with visible effort. "I'm sorry," he said, voice thick. "I can't." The door shut. Sofia stood on the porch a long moment, staring at the closed wood, more certain than ever that whatever secret this gentle old man was carrying, it was heavy enough to be crushing him alive. Costantino found his own answers that same afternoon, spread across his desk in the form of digitized records his private investigator had finally managed to recover from a backup server St. Gabriel's administration had forgotten existed. Most of the maternity ward's files from that night were exactly as damaged as the official story claimed. Smoke-stained, partially burned, consistent with the fire that had gutted 2 floors. But 3 files were different. 3 admission records, including one bearing a name he now recognized instantly. S. Brooks, bed 14, showed none of the fire damage present in every surrounding file. They'd simply been removed from the system entirely, deleted with the clean, deliberate precision of someone who understood exactly how hospital records worked, and exactly how to erase them without leaving the ragged edges a fire would have left behind. Someone had done this on purpose. Years ago, likely within days of the attack itself. Costantino's jaw tightened as understanding settled cold and absolute into his chest. This wasn't fire damage. This was a cover-up, precise and deliberate. connected somehow to the same night his wife had died and his son had been placed into his arms by a man he'd trusted completely. He picked up his phone and called Marco. "I want everything on the hospital attack investigation from 7 years ago pulled and reviewed again. Every witness statement, every survivor we interviewed at the time. Someone erased Sophia Brooks from that hospital's records deliberately, and I want to know who had the authority to do it." He didn't yet let himself follow the thought to its natural, terrifying conclusion. But some quiet, patient part of him had already begun assembling the shape of it. Sophia's missing records, Luca's uncanny resemblance to her son, Dr. Lorenzo's visible unraveling every time he saw her face. Whatever had happened that night, Costantino understood now with sudden, sick clarity. It was far from finished happening. Vittorio Gallo reached the same conclusion from an entirely different direction, and reacted with considerably less restraint. "The doctor," he told his lieutenant, voice flat with the particular calm of a man who'd already decided a course of action. "Moretti. He's the last one who actually knows what happened that night. If Ricci gets to him first, everything I built these past 7 years collapses." "You want him eliminated?" "I want him silenced. Permanently. Tonight." Dr. Lorenzo sat at his desk that evening, the finished confession letter sealed at last inside a plain white envelope, his hand steadier now than it had been in days. He'd written every detail: the fire, the chaos, the orphaned infant, the young mother he'd wrongly believed dead, the impossible decision he'd made in a hallway full of smoke that had quietly rearranged 4 lives without any of them ever knowing. He addressed the envelope with careful, deliberate strokes. To Costantino and Sophia. He was reaching for his phone, finally ready to call the estate and ask them both to come, when a sharp pain seized his chest without warning, radiating down his left arm with a suddenness that stole the breath clean out of his lungs. The envelope slipped from his fingers as he collapsed forward across the desk, one hand still stretched toward it even as his vision began to darken at the edges. The truth he'd guarded for 7 years now trapped, unspoken, inside a small white envelope no one else yet knew existed. Dr. Lorenzo's housekeeper found him collapsed across his desk at 8 the next morning, the sealed envelope still trapped beneath his outstretched hand, and called an ambulance with shaking fingers while pressing 2 fingers to his throat and praying for a pulse she wasn't certain she felt. He survived. Barely, a heart attack, the doctors said, brought on by stress they couldn't quite account for in a man who'd otherwise been in reasonable health. He drifted in and out of consciousness for 2 days, the envelope confiscated along with his other belongings and locked in a hospital drawer, its terrible secret still waiting, patient and unclaimed. Costantino learned of the collapse through Marco, and something cold settled into his chest at the timing of it. A man clearly unraveling under some private weight, hospitalized the same week Costantino had discovered deliberately erased hospital records with Sophia's name attached to them. He didn't tell Sophia everything he suspected. He wasn't entirely sure yet what he suspected, only that every thread he pulled led backward toward the same burning night, and he needed solid ground before he handed her something that might break her. The flashbacks came for him anyway, uninvited, the way grief always found its own timing. He remembered the hospital corridor thick with smoke, alarms shrieking against each other in overlapping waves. He remembered running, Isabella's name torn raw from his throat, security radios crackling reports of gunfire on the maternity floor. He remembered reaching the nursery to find chaos, nurses screaming, incubators overturned, a fire licking hungrily along one wall, while emergency staff dragged patients toward the stairwell in a desperate, disorganized current. He remembered Dr. Moretti, soot-streaked and wild-eyed, pressing a crying infant into his arms amid the pandemonium, saying words Costantino had spent 7 years trying to fully recall and never quite managing. Something about an orphan, about no family left to claim him, about needing Costantino to take the child now, immediately, before the chaos swallowed him entirely. He remembered Isabella's face, still and pale, found an hour later in a stairwell 3 floors down. What he'd never fully examined, in 7 years of grief too enormous to interrogate, was the gap between those 2 moments. The missing hour where a doctor covered in smoke had made some private, impossible decision in a burning hospital, alone, with no time and no good options. He was starting, now, to wonder exactly what that decision had cost. Sophia found him in his study that evening, staring at old photographs spread across his desk, and crossed the room without hesitation to wrap her arms around him from behind. "You've been somewhere else all day," she said softly. "I've been thinking about the night I lost Isabella." He covered her hands with his own, grateful for the solid warmth of her against his back. "I don't remember all of it. I've never let myself try. But something about the last few weeks keeps pulling me back to that hallway. Do you want to talk about it?" "Not tonight." He turned in her arms, pulling her close, and something in his face had softened past careful control into something entirely unguarded. "Tonight, I want to talk about something else." "That sounds ominous." "It isn't." He tucked a curl behind her ear, the gesture so tender it made her breath catch. "I've spent 7 years telling myself this house was complete because Luca was in it. I was wrong. It's been empty in ways I didn't let myself notice until you started filling them. Costantino. I'm not finished." His hands found her face, steady, despite the vulnerability in his voice. "I don't know what happens with the hospital records, or the man who tried to take you, or any of the answers we haven't found yet, but I know I want to build whatever comes next with you standing beside me. Not as staff, as—" His phone rang, sharp and insistent against the quiet. He almost let it go. Almost. Until he saw the caller ID. A number he didn't recognize. Area code matching the hospital where Dr. Lorenzo had been admitted. And something in his gut told him to answer. "Ricci. Mr. Ricci." A nurse's voice. Careful. Professional. "Dr. Moretti is asking for you. He's stable, but he's been quite insistent. He says it's urgent, and he specifically asked that you bring Ms. Brooks." Costantino's eyes found Sophia's across the room, both of them going very still. "We're on our way." They arrived to find Dr. Lorenzo propped against hospital pillows, thinner than Sophia remembered, a fresh IV line taped to the back of one trembling hand. His eyes, when they landed on Sophia, filled instantly with tears. "Doctor." Sophia crossed to the bedside, some old, unnamed instinct softening her toward this frightened old man despite everything. "You scared us. I'm sorry." His voice came out thin, worn down to something raw. "I'm so sorry, for more than you know." "What's this about, Lorenzo?" Costantino's voice carried its usual careful authority, though something beneath it had gone quiet, braced. The old doctor reached toward the small table beside his bed, fingers closing around a plain white envelope the nurse had returned to him that afternoon, along with his other belongings. The same envelope he'd sealed the night his heart nearly stopped. The words on its front, now smudged slightly from where his hand had gripped it too tightly through 2 days of unconsciousness. He held it against his chest, like it might still be taken from him. "I should have told you both this 7 years ago," he said, voice breaking. "I've watched you fall in love, watched you build something beautiful together, and every single day, I've let it continue. I've made this worse." "Lorenzo, you're frightening her." Costantino's hand found the small of Sophia's back, steadying, protective. "I should frighten you." Tears slid freely down the old man's weathered face now, his hand trembling around the envelope's edge. "Before either of you make another promise." He looked between them both, 7 years of guilt finally breaking loose in his eyes. "There's something you both deserve to know. You gave birth to twins, Sophia," Dr. Lorenzo said, his voice shaking as 7 years of silence finally broke. "2 boys. I delivered them myself. During the evacuation, they were separated. One stayed with you. The other was carried away by a nurse who died before she could identify him." Sophia's knees buckled, and Costantino caught her. "No, I only had Ethan." Lorenzo lowered his head. You were told what I believed was true. In the chaos, I was informed that you had died. Then I found an abandoned baby with no family to claim him. Costantino had just lost his wife and newborn son. I made the worst decision of my life. Costantino's face drained of color. Luca? Lorenzo nodded through tears. Luca is your son in every way that matters, because you raised him. But he isn't Isabella's child. Her baby died in the fire. I gave you Sophia's son because I couldn't bear to let him disappear into the system. The room fell silent, except for the heart monitor. Everything suddenly made sense to Sophia. The familiar laugh, the matching smile, the connection she had never understood. Luca wasn't just a little boy who resembled Ethan. He was Ethan's identical twin, her son, alive all along. I didn't lose him, she whispered. He's been here this whole time. Costantino looked at her, devastated. And I raised your child while you spent 7 years mourning him. Neither blamed the other. They had both been victims of one terrible mistake. Costantino's phone suddenly rang. Marco's voice was urgent. Boss, Gallo's men have breached the estate. The boys are still inside. Costantino's grief disappeared beneath cold determination. Get them to the study. We're coming. They reached the villa within minutes, racing through gunfire toward the barricaded study. Ethan and Luca were hiding behind an overturned desk, while Marco covered the shattered window. Armed men closed in outside. Without hesitation, Costantino stepped in front of Sophia and the boys just as another shot exploded through the glass. The bullet meant for his heart struck his shoulder instead. Get down, he shouted, shielding his family as Marco returned fire and killed the sniper. After a few terrifying seconds, silence fell. Marco lowered his weapon. Gallo's dead. He tried to run. It's over. Costantino looked down and saw Ethan and Luca gripping each other's hands, frightened but safe. 7 years of lies had ended in less than 2 minutes. 6 days later, the DNA test confirmed the truth they already knew. Ethan and Luca were identical twins separated at birth. We have a decision to make, Costantino said quietly. Sophia shook her head. I can't take Luca away from the only father he's ever known. Costantino smiled sadly. And I won't take Ethan from you. They both realized there was only one answer. Then we stop dividing a family that was never meant to be divided, he said, taking her hand. We build one instead. Looking into her eyes, he continued, I loved you before I knew the truth, and I love you even more now. I can't imagine my life without you. He opened a velvet ring box. Marry me, Sophia. Let Ethan and Luca grow up together. Let us become the family fate tried so hard to keep apart. Through tears, Sophia answered by kissing him. 3 months later, sunlight filled the villa as a photographer prepared a new family portrait. The old painting of Costantino, Isabella, and young Luca had been moved upstairs, honored rather than forgotten. A new canvas now waited above the fireplace. Sophia stood beside Costantino, while Rosa straightened Ethan's collar and Maria quietly wiped away happy tears. Just before the camera flashed, Ethan reached for Luca's hand. Luca smiled, and Ethan smiled back. 2 identical faces. 2 brothers finally reunited. Sophia squeezed Costantino's hand, and he squeezed hers in return. The camera clicked. For the first time in 7 years, every member of the family stood exactly where they belonged. If you loved Sophia and Costantino's journey, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, because next time, another family will discover that love always finds its way home.